The wind that blew through Santo Dedo carried the grit of a world being born and a world dying, all at once. It was a hot, restless wind, tasting of iron dust from the new railroad ties and the ancient red earth of the Arizona Territory. It scoured the raw lumber of the false front buildings, rattled the glass in the saloon window, and carried the smell of cattle grease, sweat, and cheap whiskey down the single, rutted street. The year was 1879, and the town was a raw nerve stretched between the distant, jagged line of the Mogollon Rim and the deep shadow of Cañon del Lobo. Within that canyon, hidden from most eyes, lay the sacred spring, the lifeblood of the Apache people who still called this harsh, beautiful land home. On a late afternoon when the sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, Taza Naichi rode his pinto mare into this crucible of a town. He was a man in his 30s, with the lean, hard grace of a hunter and the quiet, watchful eyes of a leader who had seen too much of war. He had once been a war leader, his name whispered with respect by his own people and with fear by the soldiers at the forts. But the seasons had changed, and now his purpose was peace, a fragile thing he tried to shield for the small band of Chiricahua who looked to him for guidance. He had come to trade cured hides for salt and flour, a simple transaction that was becoming more complicated with each passing month. He felt the eyes on him as he dismounted, the familiar weight of suspicion from the white men who saw his braids and his buckskin and saw only a threat. He was tying his mare to the hitching post in front of Ortega's mercantile when the trouble found him. It came in the form of 3 railroad men, their faces flushed with the sun and liquor, their bodies smelling of stale sweat. They swaggered out of the saloon, their boots kicking up dust, their laughter loud and coarse. "Well, look what we have here, the biggest of them." A man with a thick neck and a mean little mouth sneered. "Another one of them horse thieves." Taza did not turn. He finished his knot, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He had heard the words 1,000 times. They were stones thrown by children, and he had learned long ago not to show that they could bruise. "That's a fine-looking mare," another of the men said, stepping closer. "Too fine for the likes of you. Where'd you lift her from?" Taza turned slowly, his gaze level. He did not let anger cloud his judgment. Anger was a luxury he could not afford. "She is my horse," he said, his voice low and even. The big man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your horse and Apache ain't got nothing that a white man ain't got a better claim to." He lurched forward and grabbed the pinto's reins. "We'll just be taking her back for whatever poor soul you stole her from." Taza's hand moved, not towards the knife at his belt, but to rest on the man's wrist. His grip was not violent, but it was as unyielding as stone. "Let go of my horse." For a moment, the raw power in that quiet command held the man still, but his companions, emboldened by whiskey, surged forward. "Get him down from there! Teach the thieving savage a lesson," they yelled. They grabbed at Taza's arms, trying to haul him from the saddle, their grunts and curses fouling the hot air. Taza braced himself, his legs firm against the mare's sides. He would not be pulled down into the dust. To do so would be to lose more than his balance. It would be to lose the dignity that was one of the few things he had left. Just as the scuffle was about to explode into true violence, the clatter of the afternoon stagecoach cut through the tension. It thundered down the street, a cloud of dust and noise, pulled by 4 weary horses. It ground to a halt in front of the hotel, and the door swung open. A woman stepped out. She was not the sort of woman who usually disembarked in Santo Dedo. She was young, perhaps 26 or 27 years old, with hair the color of dark honey pinned up against the heat, though several strands had escaped to frame a face that was pale with exhaustion but set with a firm, determined jaw. She wore a simple, practical traveling dress of dark blue cotton, coated with the same red dust that covered everything. This was Catherine O'Rourke, a woman who carried her past like a worn satchel and her future like a single, precious seed. She had come west from the poverty of the eastern cities, a trained teacher and a skilled nurse, seeking a place where she could make a clean start, where her hands and her mind could build something new. Her eyes, the clear gray of a morning sky, took in the scene at the mercantile in a single, sweeping glance. She saw the struggling men, the nervous horse, the growing crowd of onlookers. Without a moment's hesitation, she walked directly into the heart of the confrontation. "Let him go," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and carried an authority that made the men pause. The big man, still grappling with Taza, turned to glare at her. "This ain't your business, lady. This is a horse thief we're dealing with." Suddenly, the third man, who had been swaying on his feet, groaned and collapsed into the dust. He lay twitching, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. "See," the big man shouted, pointing a trembling finger. "He's put some kind of devilment on him, some Apache poison." Panic rippled through the crowd, but Catherine O'Rourke did not back away. She knelt beside the fallen man, her movements swift and professional. She ignored the dust soiling her dress. She pressed her fingers to the man's throat, then laid a hand on his forehead. "He has not been poisoned," she announced, her voice cutting through the rising murmur of fear. She looked up at the accuser. "Look at his skin. It is hot and dry, not clammy. His breathing is shallow and fast, and his pulse is racing like a runaway train. Did he complain of a headache before this happened? Was he confused?" The big man stared, his mouth hanging open. "Yeah, he was talking nonsense all afternoon. Said the sun was a copper pot boiling his brains." "Exactly," Catherine said, her tone crisp and factual. "This man is suffering from sunstroke. He has been working in this terrible heat, likely without enough water, and his body can no longer cool itself. He needs to be moved into the shade immediately, and his skin must be cooled with water. If he is not tended to, he could die." She had not raised her voice, had not used a single threat. She had used knowledge as her weapon, and it was more effective than any pistol. The certainty in her voice, the simple, irrefutable logic of her diagnosis, deflated the mob's anger and fear. The confrontation was over, its ugly energy replaced by a shared, urgent concern. A man stepped out of the crowd, his face weathered by the sun and creased with a quiet sense of decency. He was of medium height, with a steady gaze that suggested he was not easily rattled. This was Pete Calder, a former cavalryman who now ran a small cattle ranch a few miles from town. He had seen enough fighting to last a lifetime and had no stomach for this kind of foolishness. "She's right," Pete said, his voice calm and reasonable. "I've seen it happen to troopers in the field. Get him over to the horse trough. Somebody fetch Dr. Adams." He then looked at the railroad men who still held Taza's arms. "And you let him go. That's Taza Naichi. He's no horse thief. His people have been in this canyon longer than this town has been a name on a map." The men released Taza, their faces a mixture of confusion and shame. They mumbled apologies and shuffled off to help their fallen friend. The crowd began to disperse, the free entertainment having come to an unspectacular end. Taza sat straight on his mare, his hands resting on the pommel. He looked down at the woman who was now directing the men in how to care for their friend. She had not glanced at him once since she began speaking. She had not intervened to save an Apache. She had intervened to save a life. And in her eyes, the two things were separate. For the first time in many years, a white person had looked at a situation involving him and had chosen to see the truth instead of the prejudice. He felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a crack in the armor he had built around his heart since the day he had lost his betrothed in a soldier's raid. He had sworn then that he would never again allow his heart to be a target, that he would walk his path alone. He nudged his mare forward until he was beside her. "You have my thanks," he said. The words felt inadequate. Catherine O'Rourke finally looked up at him. Her gray eyes met his, and for a long moment, there was a silent exchange of understanding. She saw not a savage, but a man of immense pride and deep sorrow. He saw not a meddling woman, but a person of surprising strength and compassion. "Anyone would have done the same," she said simply. though they both knew that was not true. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that conveyed more respect than a torrent of words. Then, without another sound, he turned his mare and rode out of Santo Dado, heading towards the cool shadows of the canyon, leaving Catherine standing alone in the swirling red dust. Watching the entire scene from the shaded boardwalk in front of the saloon was Silas Devereaux. He was a man who seemed immune to the dust and heat, his suit clean, his boots polished. He held a cigar between his fingers, its smoke curling lazily in the still air. He had seen Taza's quiet authority, Pete Calder's inconvenient integrity, and the unexpected arrival of the woman with the clear eyes and the steady voice. He saw them all as pieces on a board, obstacles to his ambition. His railroad needed water, and his growing herds of cattle needed it even more. The sacred spring in Canyon del Lobo was the perfect, inexhaustible source. Sheriff Cobb, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest and whose loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder, sidled up next to him. Bit of a ruckus, Mr. Devereaux. Devereaux did not take his eyes off the canyon where Taza had disappeared. Every man has a weakness. Cobb, a point of pressure. For that Apache, I thought it was just his pride, his land, but now, he took a long draw from his cigar and exhaled slowly. Now, I am beginning to think it might be people. He had the law in his pocket in the form of Sheriff Cobb, and he had a fistful of documents he claimed gave him rights to the water. All that stood in his way was one Apache chief who refused to break, and now, perhaps, a woman who refused to be afraid. Catherine watched Taza ride away until he was a small speck against the vast, red landscape. She had come here seeking a new beginning, a quiet place to teach and to heal. But the hot wind on her face felt less like a welcome and more like a warning. The water of this place, she was beginning to understand, was thicker than blood, and the land itself held its breath, waiting for the coming storm. The uneasy peace that settled over Santo Dado after the incident at the Mercantile was as thin as a layer of morning frost on the desert floor. It lasted less than a week. The inciting event came not with the roar of a gunshot, but with the rustle of paper. Silas Devereaux, with Sheriff Cobb standing at his side like a well-fed bulldog, tacked a notice to the board outside the hotel. It was a formal-looking document, heavy with official seals and elaborate script, proclaiming that by the authority of the territorial governor, Devereaux and the railroad company had been granted exclusive water rights to the outflow of the spring in Canyon del Lobo. A crowd gathered to read the notice, their murmurs a low hum of confusion and concern. Devereaux, sensing his audience, stepped onto the boardwalk. He was a master of the soothing, reasonable tone that so often concealed greed. "Now, I know this looks like a big change," he began, his voice projecting easily over the crowd. "But this is about progress. It is about the future of Santo Dado. The railroad needs a reliable water stop to bring prosperity to us all. My cattle need water to provide beef for the tables of this great nation. We will be constructing a small, temporary dam to regulate the flow, ensuring there is enough for everyone." Pete Calder pushed his way to the front. "Enough for everyone? Silas, that spring is the only water the Apache have? Their crops, their animals, their life depends on it." Sheriff Cobb puffed out his chest. "The law is the law. Pete, this here is a legal grant. As for the Apache," he shrugged, a gesture of profound indifference. "There is plenty of room for them up at the San Carlos reservation. It is probably for the best. Gets them out of our hair and onto government land where they belong." The word reservation fell like a stone into a deep well, its meaning clear to everyone. It was a sentence of slow starvation and broken spirits. Catherine O'Rourke stood at the edge of the crowd, the paper in her hand from Ortega's Mercantile forgotten. She had spent the last few days securing a small, dusty storeroom at the back of the Mercantile. Hector Ortega, the quiet, kind proprietor, had agreed to let her have it for a modest rent. It was small, but it had a window, and she had already started scrubbing the floors. imagining it filled with the sounds of children learning their letters, a place where she could store her medical supplies and tend to the sick. She had hoped for a quiet start, but the notice on the board felt like a tremor, shaking the very ground she stood on. Later that afternoon, drawn by a need to see the place at the center of the conflict, she walked towards the canyon. She did not go far, only to the place where the scrubland began to rise towards the imposing rock formations. It was there she saw the little girl. The child was no more than 7 or 8 years old, sitting in the thin shade of a mesquite tree. Her mother knelt beside her, bathing her face with a damp cloth. Even from a distance, Catherine could see the child was unwell. Her skin had a grayish pallor beneath its natural copper tone, and she shivered violently despite the oppressive heat. Catherine approached slowly, not wanting to frighten them. "Hello?" she said softly. The mother looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fierce protectiveness. She spoke a few words in her own language. Catherine held up her hands, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. "I am a nurse," she said, pointing to herself. "May I look at your child?" The mother hesitated, then gave a slight nod. Catherine knelt, her trained eyes taking in the child's symptoms. The shivering, the feverish heat of her skin, the slight yellowing of her eyes, it was a picture she recognized with a sinking heart. Malaria. The mosquitoes bred in the stagnant pools that formed when the summer heat was at its worst. "She needs quinine," Catherine said, more to herself than to the mother, "and clean water." She had a small supply of the medicine in her trunk at the hotel. She mimed drinking and pointed back towards the town, trying to convey that she could help, but the mother only shook her head, her expression one of deep mistrust. She gathered her daughter into her arms and hurried away, disappearing into the folds of the canyon. Catherine watched them go, a profound sense of helplessness washing over her. The child was sick, and because of the invisible wall that stood between the two peoples, she might die. That wall, she realized, was what Silas Devereaux and Sheriff Cobb were trying to build higher and stronger with their laws and their dam. Her resolve hardened. She could not leave. She could not turn her back on this. The next day, as if to confirm her decision, she witnessed another scene that settled the matter in her soul. She saw Silas Devereaux ride out towards the canyon, not with a surveyor's team, but with 2 armed men. She learned later from Pete Calder that Devereaux had gone to see Taza. He had not gone to negotiate. He had gone to deliver an ultimatum disguised as an offer. The meeting took place under the watchful eyes of the canyon walls. Taza stood with 2 of his warriors, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Devereaux, remaining on his horse, made his proposal. "Naichi," he said, the name sounding foreign and clipped in his mouth. "I am a reasonable man. I am willing to offer you a contract. My company will pay your people a monthly stipend. In return, you will ensure that my dam and my workers are not disturbed. Consider it a fee for protection." Taza's eyes were cold. He knew what the offer meant. It was a request for him to sell his people's birthright for a handful of coins, to become a hired guard on his own land. It was an insult wrapped in the language of business. "The water is not for sale," Taza said. "It belongs to the people, and to the land." Devereaux's smile was thin. "Everything is for sale. Chief, you would be wise to take my offer. The alternative is unpleasant. The army has a long memory." The veiled threat hung in the air, a reminder of past massacres and forced marches. But Taza did not flinch. "We will not leave our home. We will not sell our water. Your dam will not be built." He turned his back then, a gesture of finality that was more powerful than any threat he could have made. He walked away, leaving Devereaux staring after him, his face dark with anger. The lines had been drawn. That evening, Catherine finalized her arrangement with Hector Ortega. The storeroom was hers. She began unpacking her books and her small collection of medical instruments. It was a declaration. She was staying. She would open her school. and she would offer her medical skills to anyone who needed them, white or Apache, if they would have her. She knew the path she was choosing was a difficult one. She had already heard the whispers in town, the sideways glances from the wives of the shopkeepers, the woman who defended the Apache, siding with them, even in a small way, was a social transgression. It threatened to burn the very bridges she had hoped to build in this new community. She felt a familiar fear, the fear of being an outsider, of being cast out and left with nothing, the same fear that had driven her from the east. A few nights later, there was a soft knock on the back door of the mercantile. When Catherine opened it, Taza Naichi was standing there. He was alone, a silent figure in the moonlight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "The woman who is a nurse," he said finally. It was not a question. "Yes," she replied, her heart beating a little faster. "My people are sometimes sick. The children. The winter will be hard. I saw a little girl a few days ago. She was very ill." Taza nodded slowly. "She is better now. Our own medicine was strong this time, but sometimes it is not." He looked past her, into the small, clean room with its single lantern casting a warm glow. He saw the neatly stacked books, the small cot, the bottles of medicine on a shelf. He saw the beginnings of a sanctuary. "You wish to help," he stated. "I wish to teach and to heal, for anyone who needs it." He was silent for a long time, his gaze steady. He was weighing the risk, the danger of letting an outsider this close to his people, but he had also seen her courage, and he had heard the truth in her voice when she had spoken of the man with sunstroke. He was a leader, and he had to consider every possible path to survival for his band. "The winter snows will make the canyon passes difficult," he said. "I will make you an agreement. You can build a small shelter, a medical tent, near the edge of our village lands. You may tend to those who seek you out." Catherine was taken aback by the offer. It was more than she could have hoped for. "But," he continued, his voice firm, "you will not go to the sacred spring. You will not interfere with our ceremonies. You will respect our ways. If you do this, you will be safe." It was a truce, a fragile bridge being built across a chasm of mistrust. For Taza, it was a practical decision, a way to get help for his people, but it was also a challenge to the vow of solitude that had guarded his heart for so long. He was letting someone in, not into his heart, but into his world, and he felt the old, familiar fear of loss stir within him. For Catherine, it was a lifeline. It was a chance to do the work she was meant to do. She knew the dangers. She was stepping deeper into a conflict that was not her own, yet now felt inextricably linked to her future. She was a woman alone, caught between the unyielding force of a man like Silas Devereaux and the steadfast resistance of a man like Taza Naichi. "I agree to your terms," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I will respect your ways." He gave her that same slight, formal nod he had in the street, and then he was gone, melting back into the darkness as silently as he had come. Catherine closed the door, her hand resting on the rough wood. The seeds of conflict had been sown all over Santo Dedo, watered by greed and prejudice. Now, in this small room, with this quiet agreement, a different kind of seed had just been planted. She did not know if it was a seed of hope or a seed of future sorrow. She only knew that she had to stay and see it grow. Building the clinic was an act of faith against the wind. Catherine chose a spot on a flat, stony piece of ground that Taza had indicated, a place that was technically on his people's land but visible from the trail leading to town. It offered no shelter from the sun or the ceaseless wind that swept down from the high mesas. The canvas tent, purchased with most of her remaining money, flapped and bucked like a living thing as she and Pete Calder struggled to raise it. Pete had arrived one morning in his wagon, unasked, with a load of scrap lumber for a floor, a small crate of nails, and a quiet determination to help. He said little. His hammer blows a steady rhythm against the howl of the wind. He told her it was the right thing to do, And for a man like Pete, no more explanation was necessary. The inside of the tent was a small pocket of order in the vast wilderness. A sturdy table, also from Pete's wagon, served as her examination surface. A set of shelves held her precious bottles of laudanum, carbolic acid, and quinine. A small cot was folded against one wall. It was a fragile shelter, a pale beacon of hope that seemed as if it might be torn away by the next strong gust. Yet, when the canvas was battened down and a lantern was lit, it held a surprising warmth, a sense of sanctuary against the encroaching dark. Her first and most important ally from the Apache camp was a young woman named Nalin. She was barely 19, with a lithe, quick grace and intelligent, watchful eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She had approached the tent on the second day, a silent observer, until Catherine, struggling to understand an elderly woman's description of a persistent cough, looked at her in desperation. Nalin had stepped forward and, in hesitant but clear English, translated the woman's words. From that moment on, she became Catherine's shadow, her interpreter, and her bridge to a world she could not have entered alone. Nalin was a quick learner, and soon she was not just translating but anticipating Catherine's needs, cleaning instruments, and calming fearful children with a soft murmur in their own tongue. Her supplies dwindled faster than she had anticipated. Hector Ortega, the mercantile owner, proved to be another silent partner in her venture. When she went to him to purchase more bandages or liniment, he would nod gravely, fetch the items, and make a small note in a ledger he kept beneath the counter. He always refused her money, telling her with a kind, weary look that payment could wait for a better day. He knew, as she did, that she was making powerful enemies, and this was his quiet way of taking a stand. For the first few weeks, her work was a slow and steady trickle of everyday ailments. She treated children for fevers, set a boy's broken arm, and gave ointments for skin rashes caused by the constant, irritating dust. Trust was built slowly, one small act of kindness at a time. The Apache were wary, their history with white people a long and painful lesson in betrayal. But the sight of their children recovering, of pain being eased, began to soften their reserve. The real test, however, came not from the canyon but from the direction of the railroad. A sickness broke out among the laborers, a violent, dehydrating flux that struck without warning. The men were living in a squalid camp downstream from where Silas Devereaux's men had begun preliminary work for their dam. The water they drank was from a shallow, muddy seep, contaminated by the camp's own waste. The camp foreman, a hard man named Johnson, initially dismissed it as nothing more than bad whiskey. But when 3 men became too weak to stand, and a 4th was delirious with fever, panic set in. One of the workers, the very man Catherine had treated for sunstroke that first day, remembered her and rode his mule to her tent. She found the camp in a state of grim misery. The air was thick with the foul smell of sickness. Men lay on filthy blankets in the scant shade, groaning in pain. Johnson tried to block her way, his face a mask of suspicion. He told her they did not need any help from an Apache lover. Catherine ignored him. She walked directly to the nearest sick man and began her examination. The symptoms were terrifyingly clear. She told the men gathered around that their water was poisoned, not by malice, but by filth. She explained in simple, direct terms that they had to stop drinking from the seep immediately. All water, she instructed, must be boiled for at least 10 minutes before it was fit to drink. She showed them how to make a crude but effective soap using rendered fat and wood ash, insisting they wash their hands after caring for the sick. She worked for 2 days without rest, moving from man to man, administering laudanum to ease their cramping and forcing them to drink boiled, cooled water. Nalin, who had insisted on coming with her, proved invaluable. Her quiet competence a steadying presence amidst the chaos. Slowly, painstakingly, the tide began to turn. 2 of the most seriously ill men began to show signs of recovery. A fragile sense of hope entered the camp. On the third day, Silas Devereaux rode into the camp. He took in the scene with a cold, appraising eye. One of the men had died in the night, his body too ravaged by the sickness before Catherine had arrived. Devereaux used this tragedy as his weapon. He stood before the exhausted laborers and pointed a finger at Catherine. He announced that this woman's strange medicines were what was harming them. He claimed her remedies were nothing more than Apache witchcraft, designed to weaken them, to drive them off the land. His voice was smooth and persuasive, planting seeds of fear in their weary minds. Some of the men, their judgment clouded by fear and prejudice, began to mutter in agreement. The foreman, Johnson, ordered her to leave. Catherine stood her ground, her face pale with exhaustion and anger, and told them plainly that they were fools if they listened to him. But the tide of opinion had turned against her. With a heavy heart, she packed her bag and left, calling out one last time for them to please keep boiling the water. She and Nalin walked back to their tent in silence, the weight of the defeat heavy on their shoulders. The incident had deepened the chasm between her and the town. She had saved lives, but in the process, she had been branded a pariah. A few days later, a commotion from the Apache village sent Nalin running to the medical tent. A child, chasing after a lizard, had darted towards a thicket of cholla cactus. Taza, who had been nearby, had moved with the speed of a striking snake, shoving the boy out of the way. In doing so, his own forearm had raked across the spiny branches. Nalin brought him to Catherine's tent. He stood silently, his arm held stiffly at his side, his face set like granite. The wound was not deep, but it was ugly. A long, bloody gash filled with dozens of needle-sharp spines. Catherine's professionalism took over. She motioned for him to sit. She told Nalin to tell him that she needed to remove the spines before she could clean the wound, and that it would be painful. Taza simply nodded, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the canvas wall. Working by the light of a lantern, she used a pair of fine tweezers to pull out each spine. He did not flinch, did not make a sound, though she saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. When the last spine was out, she cleaned the gash thoroughly with carbolic acid and water. The wound would need stitches. She threaded a needle, her hands steady. She explained through Nalin what she was about to do. He nodded again. She placed her left hand gently on his forearm to steady it. His skin was warm, the muscles hard as weathered oak beneath her fingers. It was the first time they had touched. This quiet, deliberate contact. A current seemed to pass between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the intimacy of the act. She was not just treating a wound. She was mending the flesh of a man who had armored himself against all forms of tenderness. She worked quickly, her stitches small and neat. He never took his eyes from that invisible point on the wall. When she was finished, she bandaged the arm tightly. She told him to keep it clean and to return in a few days so she could check her work. He stood, looked at the clean white bandage, and then his dark eyes finally met hers. He gave her a single, solemn nod of thanks, and left the tent. The next evening, as the sun was setting and casting long shadows from the canyon walls, he returned. He stopped before the entrance to her tent and stood waiting for her to emerge. He held something in his closed fist. When she came out, he opened his hand. Resting on his palm was a perfect arrowhead, chipped from a piece of black obsidian. It was a beautiful and deadly object, its edges still lethally sharp. The volcanic glass seemed to drink the last of the evening light. He held it out to her. His words were quiet, spoken in his own language. And Nalin, standing nearby, translated softly. He said that a life saved created a debt, that his arm was needed to protect his people, that by healing it, she had protected them as well. The arrowhead was the acknowledgement of that debt. Catherine reached out and took it. The obsidian was cool and smooth against her skin, but it felt heavy, weighted with a significance that went far beyond its physical size. It was a symbol of a promise made in a language of honor she was only just beginning to understand. It represented the memory of a wound, a shared moment of vulnerability and trust. She looked from the arrowhead in her hand to the man standing before her, his bandaged arm a stark white line in the gathering dusk. The fragile tent flapped in the wind behind her, a tiny, warm shelter, holding its own against the vast and hostile landscape. She knew then that this small piece of sharpened stone was a bond, and it tied her to this place and to this man, more securely than any rope or chain. The hand of the desert could be a healer, but it could also be a fist. It showed its knuckles first. The sky did not darken. It turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind, which had been a constant, sighing presence, fell away into an unnerving silence. Birds stopped singing. The air grew thick and heavy, making each breath feel like a conscious effort. Catherine stood at the entrance of her tent, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. Nylan, who was grinding herbs nearby, looked up at the sky, and her face became still and serious. She spoke one word in her own language, a word that sounded like a stone dropping into a deep well. Then the wind returned, not as a sigh, but as a roar. A solid wall of red dust, 1,000 feet high, rolled towards them from the plains. It consumed the horizon, swallowing the mountains and the sky. The wind ceased to be a sound and became a physical presence, a monstrous force that tore at the canvas of the medical tent. Catherine and Aline scrambled to secure the flaps, their skirts whipping around them. The tent groaned, its ropes straining and screaming against the stakes. Darkness fell in an instant, a suffocating gritty blackness that filled her mouth and nose and eyes. Inside the tent, the lantern flame danced wildly, casting long, frantic shadows. The structure shuddered, threatening to collapse or be torn from its moorings and sent tumbling across the desert. For what felt like an eternity, there was only the sound of the wind's fury and the feeling of the world being scoured clean. When the storm finally passed, it left behind a world transformed. Everything was coated in a fine red powder. The air was still and strangely cool. But the storm had left a parting gift. A single, jagged fork of lightning had stabbed down into a patch of dry creosote bushes a few hundred yards from the tent. Now, a thin finger of orange flame was licking at the dry grass, growing with terrifying speed, fanned by the returning breeze. "Fire!" Nylan screamed, her voice sharp with panic. The word galvanized them. The fire was moving fast, a hungry beast consuming the dry brush that littered the ground between the village and the clinic. Sparks flew into the air, carried by the wind, starting smaller fires wherever they landed. The medical tent, made of canvas and hope, stood directly in its path. In moments, the quiet camp exploded into organized chaos. Taza was there, his voice a low, commanding rumble that cut through the growing panic. He directed the women to gather the children and take them to the safety of the shallow caves at the base of the canyon. Men appeared with wet blankets and shovels. A human chain formed, stretching from the small creek that fed the spring to the edge of the fire. Pete Calder arrived as if summoned by the smoke itself, his face grim, his wagon loaded with empty water barrels. He joined the bucket brigade without a word. Catherine, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, took her place in the line between Pete and Nylan. The work was brutal and rhythmic. A heavy, water-filled bucket was slapped into her hands. She passed it down the line towards the men at the front who were dousing the flames, and an empty bucket was immediately passed back. Her muscles screamed in protest. The smoke was a thick, acrid perfume that burned her lungs and made her eyes stream with tears. The heat was a physical blow, a wave that threatened to buckle her knees. She saw Taza at the very edge of the fire, beating at the flames with a wet blanket, his movements economical and fearless. For a terrifying moment, a gust of wind sent a wall of flame leaping towards him, and her heart seized in her chest. But he moved back with the fluid grace of a dancer, his focus absolute, his body a weapon against the inferno. He was not just fighting a fire. He was defending his home, his people, and the small, fragile tent that had become a symbol of something he could not yet name. They fought for hours, a desperate, united force against the uncaring power of nature. They were not Apache or white. They were simply people, their faces blackened by soot, their bodies united in a single, desperate purpose to survive. Finally, as the sky began to bleed with the first light of dawn, the last of the flames was extinguished. They had saved the village. They had saved the tent. They stood in the gray morning light, a small, exhausted army, surveying the field of battle. A wide, black scar was burned across the land. The air smelled of ash and wet earth. Catherine's hands were raw. Her body ached in places she did not know she had. But a strange sense of elation filled her. They had faced the fist of the desert, and they had not broken. But Silas Devereaux did not fight with fire. He fought with the quiet turning of screws in the night. While the village recovered, while Catherine tended to the burns and smoke inhalation of the firefighters, his men worked under the cover of darkness. They did not use dynamite or heavy equipment. They worked with shovels and saws and mules. And by the time the sun rose 2 days after the fire, it was done. It was Taza who found it. He had gone to the sacred spring for his morning prayers, a ritual as essential to him as breathing. He found the outlet, the place where the clear, life-giving water flowed out of the rocks to form the creek that sustained them, choked by a hastily built dam of raw lumber and packed earth. The flow was not stopped entirely, but it was reduced to a pathetic trickle, a fraction of its former strength. The spring's voice, which had always been a happy, gurgling song, was now a dying whisper, a cold, hard anger, the kind he had not allowed himself to feel in years, settled in Taza's chest. He followed the line of newly laid pipes that led away from the dam, over a low rise and towards the railroad line. The theft had been quiet, efficient, and utterly devastating. By midday, the effects were already visible. The small herd of goats and sheep huddled by the nearly dry creek bed, bleating in distress. The corn stalks in the communal garden, which had been green and healthy, were already beginning to wilt under the relentless sun. Panic, a more insidious enemy than fire, began to creep through the village. The water was their life. Without it, they could not survive the coming winter. To lose the water was to lose their home. Before Taza could even decide on a course of action, Sheriff Cobb and 2 deputies rode into the village. Cobb did not dismount. He sat on his horse, his belly hanging over his saddle horn, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. "Taza Naichi," he boomed. "I have a complaint here from Mr. Devereaux. Says you and your people have been threatening his work crew, sabotaging his property." Taza looked at him, his face expressionless. "His property is on our land. He is stealing our water." Cobb waved a piece of paper. "According to this legal document, the water is his, and for the crime of threatening a lawful enterprise. I am fining you $100. He paused for effect. "Payable in cash. Or horses. I will take 5 of your best horses." It was extortion, plain and simple. There was no evidence, no trial, just the raw, corrupt power of a bought lawman. Taza knew he could not fight them. Not here, not now. To do so would bring the soldiers, and that was a fight his small band could not win. Silently, he motioned for one of his men to bring the horses. The fine was paid. The injustice was absolute. The pressure on Taza began to mount, not just from outside, but from within. That evening, the elders of his band came to his wickiup. They were grim-faced, their words heavy. An elder named Goya, a man whose face was a map of countless seasons, spoke for them all. He spoke of the dwindling water, of Devereaux's aggression, of the coming hardships. "We are a small band," Goya said, his voice raspy with age. "We need allies. We need strength. A leader needs a wife. He needs children to carry on his name and his spirit. It is time for you to marry, to make a strong match, to show our enemies that we are growing, that we will endure. They had brought this up before, gently, but now their words had the force of a command. There were several eligible young women in the band. Good, strong women who would make a fine wife for their chief. But Taza shook his head, his refusal quiet but unyielding. "I have made a vow," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I will not marry." The vow was a wall he had built around the empty space where his heart had been. He could not, would not, risk that kind of loss again. To love someone, to build a family, was to give the world another hostage, another target for the random cruelty of fate and the calculated cruelty of men like Devereaux. He would lead his people. He would fight for them. He would die for them. But he would do it alone. The elders left in silence, their disappointment a palpable weight in the small dwelling. Catherine heard the rumors from Nalin. She learned of the pressure on Taza to marry, of his steadfast refusal. A strange, unsettling feeling stirred within her. She told herself it was none of her concern. She was a guest here, a transient. Her work was to heal bodies, not to mend the complex fabric of a people's lives or to involve herself in the private grief of their chief. She was just a passerby, a witness to their struggle. She repeated the words to herself in the quiet of her tent at night, but they sounded increasingly hollow. The land was no longer just a place she was passing through. The fire, the bucket brigade, the shared fear and triumph had burned away her detachment. The obsidian arrowhead she kept wrapped in a soft cloth felt warm to the touch, a constant reminder of a debt that was more than just a matter of honor. The pace of life had quickened, the rhythm of a slow walk breaking into a desperate run, and she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that she was running right alongside them. Market day in Santo Dedo was a temporary truce in the ongoing war with the desert. It was a day when the relentless silence of the landscape was broken by the cacophony of human commerce. Dust, the town's constant companion, was kicked up by the hooves of mules, the wheels of farm wagons, and the boots of ranchers, miners, and railroad men. The air was a rich stew of smells, fresh bread from the hotel kitchen, leather goods baking in the sun, the sharp scent of onions and peppers laid out on blankets, and the ever-present aroma of livestock. It was a day of gossip, of haggling, of community, a brief, vibrant flowering of life in the harsh terrain. Catherine came to the market with a list written on a scrap of paper. She needed cotton for bandages, more carbolic acid if Hector Ortega had any, and perhaps some dried beans and flour for herself and Nalin. The work at the clinic had been relentless since the fire, and their supplies were low. She moved through the throng, an island of quiet purpose in the boisterous sea of people. She nodded politely to those she recognized, receiving a few curt nods in return, but mostly she was met with averted eyes and whispered comments that followed her like a trail of smoke. The town had not forgiven her for tending to the railroad men, nor for her open association with the Apache. She was an outsider, marked by her compassion. Taza was also there. He had brought a small bundle of expertly cured deer and rabbit hides to trade for salt, a commodity more precious than gold to his people. He stood near the edge of the makeshift market, a tall, silent figure who drew looks of fear and resentment in equal measure. He conducted his business with Hector Ortega in a few quiet words, his face impassive, revealing nothing of the turmoil that raged within him. The dwindling water of the spring was a constant, aching pressure. The fine he had paid to Cobb had been a bitter pill. The words of his elders echoed in his mind, urging him to take a wife, to strengthen his people, to abandon the lonely vow that had become both his shield and his cage. Their paths crossed near the public well in the center of the square. It was not by design, but by the simple, random currents of the crowd. For a moment, they stood near each other, not speaking, but aware of each other's presence with an intensity that seemed to bend the very air between them. It was this small, silent moment of proximity that drew the unwanted attention. Evelyn Grant saw them. She was a young widow, her husband having been taken by a fever the previous winter. She was pretty in a sharp, brittle way, and she had once made it known, through a series of subtle invitations, that she would not be opposed to becoming the wife of a man with land and status. She had even set her sights, briefly and foolishly, on the untouchable Apache chief, seeing in his quiet power a prize to be won. Taza had rebuffed her gentle advances with a polite but absolute finality that had curdled her interest into a spiteful resentment. Now, seeing him standing near the woman everyone was talking about, she saw her chance for a small, public revenge. She was standing with a group of other ranchers' wives, a clutch of women who served as the town's self-appointed moral arbiters. "Well, look there," Evelyn said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard over the noise of the market. "It seems our little saint has found her savage." The other women tittered, their eyes darting towards Catherine and Taza. The comments began to fly. "Small, poisoned arrows. I heard she keeps a tent right at the edge of their filthy camp. Disgraceful. A white woman like her. What do you suppose she does out there with them all night?" Catherine's back stiffened. She tried to ignore them, to finish her business and leave. But the circle of whispers was tightening, the words growing louder, bolder. Taza stood like a statue, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, pretending not to hear the insults that were clearly aimed at him through her. Evelyn, emboldened by her audience, took a step forward. Her voice was now loud and clear, a direct challenge. "You best be careful. Miss O'Rourke," she called out, a malicious smile playing on her lips. "He will never have you. Everyone knows the Apache chief refuses all the women of his own tribe. What makes you think he would want you? A brand new virgin girl, all infatuated with a redskin chief." The insult was crude and direct, designed for maximum humiliation. It touched upon race, upon Catherine's unmarried status, and upon the unspoken dangerous attraction that crackled in the air. The crowd around them grew quiet. This was better than a dogfight. This was a public shaming. Catherine felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She wanted to turn and run, to disappear, to be anywhere but here, pinned by the collective stare of the entire town. She looked at Taza and saw the rigid set of his jaw, the stony mask that hid his own shame and fury. He was trapped, unable to defend her honor without starting a fight that could have deadly consequences for his people. And in that moment, something inside Catherine shifted. It was not anger that rose in her, but a fierce, protective clarity. She saw his pain, his helplessness, and she understood that the true target of Evelyn's venom was not her, but the vow that kept him so isolated. The taunts were not just about her reputation. They were an attack on the very core of his being. She would not let it stand. She did not raise her voice. She did not trade insults. She took a single, deliberate step forward, closing the small space between herself and Taza. The crowd held its breath. She reached out and laid her hand gently on his forearm. Her fingers did not rest on the buckskin of his sleeve, but on the faint, silvery line of the scar she had stitched closed weeks ago. The scar from the cactus, the wound he had taken to protect a child. It was their shared history, a mark of his courage and her care. It was the place where they had first truly connected. He flinched, not from her touch, but from the shock of it. So public, so unexpected. His dark eyes darted down to meet hers. Catherine looked not at Evelyn, but directly at the stunned faces of the crowd. Her voice was perfectly calm, but it rang with an astonishing authority, clear and carrying to every corner of the silent market square. "The Apache chief refused every bride," she said, her fingers pressing ever so slightly on the healed wound, until one gentle virgin touch broke his sacred vow. The words hung in the stunned silence. They were audacious, shocking, and utterly ambiguous. It was not a boast. It was not a proposal of marriage. It was a statement of fact, a truth aimed not at the crowd's ears, but at Taza's soul. She was not claiming his hand. She was challenging his fear. She was telling him, and the world, that his vow, the stony fortress he had built around his heart, was not invincible. It could be breached, not by force or by seduction, but by a simple, healing touch. An absolute stillness descended upon the market. Mules stood frozen. Haggling ceased. Evelyn Grant's jaw had dropped, her face a comical mask of disbelief. The ranchers' wives looked as if they had been turned to stone. Taza was thunderstruck. He felt the light pressure of her fingers on his scar as if it were a brand. He stared down at her, at the quiet courage in her gray eyes, and felt a profound, seismic shock. It was not shame he felt. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sense of being seen, of being understood in a way no one had ever understood him before. She had looked past his defenses, past his pride, and had seen the lonely prisoner within. She had not mocked his vow, she had named it, and in naming it, had revealed its fragility. The moment stretched, taut and shimmering. It was Pete Calder who finally broke the spell. He had been standing nearby, watching the entire exchange with a look of weary disapproval. He stepped forward and clapped his hands together loudly. "Well," he said in his dry, gravelly voice, "now that the wedding announcements have been made, perhaps some of us can get back to the business of buying flour before it gets any hotter than the devil's own forge." His plain, earthy humor was the pin that burst the balloon of tension. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. People shuffled their feet, suddenly embarrassed to have been caught staring. The moment of high drama was over. The women who had been with Evelyn suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, melting back into the crowd and leaving the widow standing alone, her face flushed with fury and defeat. From the shaded boardwalk of the saloon, Silas Devereaux had watched the entire scene unfold with keen interest. He took a slow puff from his cigar. His eyes narrowed in thought. He had seen the public challenge, the Apache chief's stunned reaction, and the unbreakable connection in that single, shared glance. He was a man who understood leverage. He had always believed that to control a man, you had to control what he valued most. He had assumed that for Taza Naichi, that was his land, his water. Now, he saw he had been wrong. The Apache chief's greatest vulnerability was no longer a place, it was a person, and she had just announced it to the entire town. The ride back from Santo Dedo was a silent one. Catherine O'Rourke and Taza Naichi had parted ways without a word at the edge of town, each retreating into the sanctuary of their own world. But the quiet was deceptive. The air between them, and within them, was filled with the reverberating shock of her words in the market square. Catherine felt a tremor of fear at her own audacity. Yet beneath it was a bedrock of certainty that she had done the right thing. Taza rode with a storm raging behind his stony facade. Her words had been a key turning a lock he had thought rusted shut forever. She had seen him, and the feeling was both a liberation and a terror. That night, the desert was unnaturally still. The wind held its breath, and the stars seemed sharp and close, like chips of ice in the black sky. Sleep did not come easily to anyone. There was a feeling of something borrowed, a peace that could not last. The attack came in the deepest hour of the night, the hour of ghosts and predators. It was not a sound that woke Catherine, but a smell, the sharp, acrid scent of burning pine and something else, something savory, like roasting grain. Then came the cry, a single, terrified shout that sliced through the darkness, followed by an eruption of panicked yells. She scrambled from her cot, pulling on her boots and grabbing her medical bag. Outside the tent, the scene was a nightmare vision. Against the sheer, black walls of the canyon, a monstrous orange flower was blooming, the large, sturdy wickiup that served as the village's communal storehouse, the place where they kept the dried corn, smoked meat, and gathered nuts for the coming winter, was engulfed in flames. This was not the wild, random anger of a brush fire. This was a targeted blow, an act of calculated cruelty aimed at the heart of their survival. It was an attempt to starve them out, to break their will before the first snows fell. The village was a whirlwind of frantic activity, yet there was a desperate order to it. Taza was a dark silhouette against the fire, his voice not shouting, but cutting through the noise with sharp, clear commands. The fire was too large to be fought with blankets and buckets alone. The roof was already a lattice of glowing embers. The priority was salvage. The children, a woman screamed, and Catherine's purpose became clear. She and Aylin ran towards the residential wickiups, their voices calm but urgent, gathering the terrified. Crying children, they led the small, coughing flock away from the smoke and heat, towards the cool, dark mouths of the shallow caves that lined the base of the canyon. They settled the children on blankets, murmuring reassurances they did not feel themselves. With the children safe, Catherine ran back towards the fire. A line of men and women had formed, passing salvaged sacks and clay pots away from the inferno. The heat was a physical wall, and the smoke was a choking blanket that stole the breath from her lungs. She joined the line, her hands grabbing rough burlap sacks, her eyes streaming, her throat raw. They worked with a silent, desperate fury, saving what they could from the ruin. The main support beam of the storehouse groaned, a deep, resonant sound of surrender. Sparks rained down, and a section of the thatched roof collapsed inward, sending a geyser of flame and smoke into the night sky. "It is lost! Get back!" Taza commanded, his voice hoarse. The line broke, people stumbling back from the intense heat. But in that moment, Catherine saw it, just inside the burning doorway. A small, leather-wrapped bundle had been knocked to the ground. She recognized it. It was a collection of rare medicinal herbs that one of the elder women had spent the entire summer gathering. Herbs essential for treating the lung sicknesses that came with the winter cold. She did not think. She acted. She ducked under the arm of a man who tried to stop her, held her breath, and plunged into the smoke-filled entrance. The heat was like a furnace blast. She grabbed the bundle, the leather hot to the touch. She turned to run, but the smoke was a thick, black poison. It filled her lungs. The world dissolved into a dizzying, gray swirl. Her knees buckled, and the last thing she felt was the rough, packed earth rising up to meet her. She awoke to the sensation of the ground beneath her and a hand holding hers. It was not a gentle, comforting hold, but a desperate, crushing grip, as if the person holding it was trying to anchor her to the world of the living. She coughed, a dry, racking sound, and her lungs burned. She blinked, her vision slowly clearing. Taza was kneeling beside her, his face inches from hers. He was a terrifying sight, his face streaked with soot, his hair singed. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. But it was his eyes that held her. In their dark depths, she saw none of the stoic reserve, none of the leader's composure. She saw raw, naked fear. It was the look of a man who had just stared into the abyss and seen something precious about to be taken from him. He felt her stir, saw her eyes open, and a shudder ran through his entire body. His grip on her hand loosened slightly, though he did not let go. He did not speak. He could not. He only watched her, his breath still coming in ragged bursts, as if he were the one who had been pulled from the smoke. The space between them was filled with the roar of the dying fire and the silent, deafening thunder of his relief. He helped her sit up, his hand moving to her back to support her. The intimacy of the moment was profound, stripped bare of all pretense by the night's terror. It was a closeness born not of romance, but of shared peril and the stark, undeniable truth of what they had almost lost. Later, as the fire finally burned itself out, leaving a smoldering black skeleton against the pale dawn, Taza stood looking over his village. The people were exhausted, soot-stained, and frightened, but they were alive. The children were safe. Catherine was sitting by the creek, her face pale but her breathing steady, alive. The storehouse was gone, a devastating blow. But as he looked at the faces of his people, at Catherine's face, a profound realization settled over him. He had built his vow of solitude as a shield against the pain of loss. He had thought that by refusing to love, by refusing to build a family, he could avoid the agony he had felt when his first love was torn from him. But watching the flames consume their winter stores, watching Catherine fall into the smoke, he understood his mistake. The fear was not of loving. The fear was of failing to protect those he loved. His vow was not a shield. It was a prison. It had not kept the pain out. It had only kept the connection, the strength, the reason for fighting, from getting in. He felt the stone wall he had built around his heart tremble, and for the first time in a decade, a deep, structural crack appeared in its foundation. The sun rose on a scene of grim determination. The Apache began the work of sifting through the ashes, their faces set with a weary resolve. They had suffered a blow, but they were not broken. But their enemies gave them no time to recover. Just after midday, Sheriff Cobb rode into the camp, this time with 4 heavily armed deputies. He had a warrant in his hand. "Taza Naichi," Cobb announced, his voice oozing with false authority. "This morning, Silas Devereaux filed a formal complaint with the county magistrate. He has submitted maps and titles proving his legal right to the water from the spring. He has also filed a sworn statement that you have personally threatened his work and conspired to damage his property." Pete Calder, who had arrived with a wagon of salvaged lumber and food from his own stores, stepped forward. "That is a lie, Sheriff, and you know it. Taza has done nothing of the sort." Cobb ignored him. "By the authority of the Arizona Territory," he continued, "I am placing you under arrest for threatening a public works project and conspiracy to commit sabotage." 2 deputies dismounted and moved towards Taza, their hands on their pistols. Taza stood perfectly still. He looked at the faces of his people, at Nolan's angry tears, at Catherine's horrified disbelief. He knew this was a trap. Any resistance would be met with violence, and it would be called a riot. He would be painted as a savage, and the soldiers would come. He raised his hands slowly, a gesture of submission that was, in its own way, an act of supreme defiance. He would not give them the fight they wanted. The deputies bound his wrists in front of him with a rough rope. As they led him away, he passed Catherine. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not defeat, but a silent, urgent message. Be strong. Do not be afraid. As the posse rode out of the canyon with their prisoner, Pete Calder turned to the small group of other ranchers who had come to offer their help. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice low and hard. "This is not about the law. This is about theft. I am riding to the county seat. I am going to draw up a petition, and I am going to get every decent man in this valley to sign it. Devereaux may have bought the sheriff, but he has not bought all of us." The air in the Apache camp after Taza's arrest was thin and brittle, like the shell of a bird's egg. Hope had been taken away with their leader. The people moved with a heavy, listless quiet, their face etched with a familiar despair. Catherine felt a suffocating helplessness. The law, which should have been a shield for the innocent, had been twisted into a club. Pete Calder had ridden off with his petition, a noble but slow-moving gesture in a crisis that was accelerating by the hour. Action was needed now. Her mind, trained in the logic of diagnosis and treatment, searched for a different kind of remedy. She went to Hector Ortega's mercantile under the cover of dusk. The shop was closed, but a single lantern burned in the back room. She knocked softly on the rear door. Hector opened it, his kind, weary face full of concern. Inside, she laid out her idea. It was a desperate gambit, a shot in the dark. The railroad had brought more than just tracks and laborers to Santo Dedo. It had brought the telegraph, a thin metal wire, humming with invisible messages, connected their small, isolated town to the wider world, to Prescott, to the seat of the territorial government. Silas Devereaux and Sheriff Cobb control what happens in this town, she explained, her voice a low, urgent whisper. But they do not control the territory. There are inspectors, magistrates who are not in Devereaux's pocket. If we could send a message, a request for an independent federal survey of the spring. Hector listened, stroking his graying mustache. He nodded slowly. The telegraph operator is a young man, Samuel Jones, a good boy. He reads books. He believes in fairness, but he is also afraid of the sheriff. We must try, Catherine insisted. An hour later, they were in the small telegraph office. The air was close, smelling of ozone and metal. Samuel, a boy of no more than 20 with a shock of sandy hair and nervous hands, looked at them with wide, frightened eyes. Hector spoke to him in calm, reassuring tones, explaining the injustice of Taza's arrest, the fraudulent nature of Devereaux's claim. Catherine drafted the message, choosing her words with the care of a surgeon. She wrote of the long-standing Apache claim to the water, the suspicious documents produced by the railroad, and the escalating tensions that threatened to erupt into violence. She formally requested, on behalf of concerned citizens of Santo Dedo, an immediate and impartial survey by a territorial land agent. Samuel's hands trembled as he looked at the message. To send it would be an act of defiance against the most powerful men in town. He could lose his job, or worse. He looked at Catherine's determined face, at Hector's steady gaze, and a flicker of courage ignited in his young heart. He sat down at the key, his fingers finding their rhythm. The quiet room filled with the sharp, staccato clicking of the telegraph. A tiny, metallic voice of hope sent out into the vast, dark expanse of the territory. The counter-move from their enemy came faster and was far more brutal than they could have imagined. Silas Devereaux was not a man who waited for petitions or territorial inspectors. He understood that the quickest way to break a people was to steal their future. Nalin was that future. She had gone to the creek at dusk to gather cool stones to place on the forehead of a feverish child. It was a task she had performed 100 times. A simple act of care in a place that had always been a sanctuary. But the world had changed. 2 men emerged from the shadows of the cottonwood trees. They were rough men, the kind who worked for wages and asked no questions. Nayland did not even have time to scream. A coarse hand was clamped over her mouth, and she was dragged away into the darkness. The news ripped through the village like a blade. The grief and fear were absolute. They had taken one of their own, a beloved daughter, the voice of the next generation. The next morning, the cell door in the Santo Dedo jail swung open. It was not Sheriff Cobb who stood there, but Silas Devereaux. He had Taza brought into the sheriff's office. The room was stuffy, the air stale with cigar smoke. On the desk lay a document, a treaty, written in dense legal language. It was a complete and total relinquishment of any and all Apache claims to the water of the sacred spring. Next to it lay a single eagle feather, Nayland's. A simple business transaction. Chief, Devereaux said, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. You sign this paper. The girl is returned, unharmed, a bit frightened, perhaps, but safe. You refuse to sign. He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished and all the more terrifying for it. Sheriff Cobb will release you, a gesture of my good faith. You have until sunrise tomorrow to deliver the signed document to the dam site. After that, my offer expires. And so, I fear, does the girl. Taza was released into the harsh light of day, a free man, but he had never felt more shackled. He walked back to his village, each step a testament to his impossible choice. To sign the paper would be to condemn his people to a slow death, to surrender the very soul of their existence. To refuse would be to condemn Nayland. He found his people gathered, their faces turned to him, their eyes full of a desperate hope he could not fulfill. He told them of the choice he had been given. A wail of grief rose from Nayland's mother. The weight of leadership pressed down on Taza, a physical force threatening to crush him. He could not sign. He could not sacrifice the tribe for one person, even a person as precious as Nayland. and he could not leave her to her fate. There was only one path left, the old path, the path of the warrior. He began to prepare, gathering his knife, a rope, a small pouch of water. He would go alone. This was his burden to bear. Catherine found him by the creek, his face a mask of cold fury and controlled despair. "You cannot go alone," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is not your fight," he said without looking at her. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "It is a matter for the people." "Nalin is my friend," she countered, "and those men work for Devereaux. They will expect you to come up the main trail from the canyon. They will be watching for you. But there is another way." He finally turned to look at her. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. "When I first came here," she explained, speaking quickly, "I would walk in the hills to learn the land. I found the old prospector's trail, the one that leads up the back of Eagle's Tooth Rock. There is a bridge there, a suspension bridge made of rope and wood. It looks broken, but the main supports are still anchored in the rock. It is dangerous, but it will take you to the outcrop from above, behind them. That is where a man would hide a prisoner." He stared at her, his mind processing her words. She was offering him not just help, but tactical knowledge, a key to unlock the trap that had been set for him. To accept her help was to admit he could not do this alone. It was to trust her not just with his life, but with Nalin's. The last of his resistance crumbled, not to her logic, but to the undeniable truth that their fates were now intertwined. They left as the moon rose, two silent figures melting into the landscape of rock and shadow. The journey was a grueling climb up treacherous scree slopes and through narrow, winding ravines that smelled of dust and cold stone. They finally reached the bridge. It was a terrifying sight. A skeletal spine of rotting wood and frayed rope swaying gently in the night wind over a chasm of absolute blackness. "I will go first," Taza said. He tested the anchor ropes, then began to cross, his movements as sure and light as a spider on a thread. He reached the other side and turned, a dark silhouette against the stars. Now it was her turn. Catherine's heart pounded against her ribs. She kept her eyes fixed on Taza, a steady beacon in the darkness. She moved slowly, one hand over the other on the rope railing, her boots finding precarious purchase on the weathered planks. A board groaned under her weight. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She felt Taza's gaze on her, a tangible force willing her forward. She took another step, and then another, until she felt the solid rock of the far side beneath her feet. From their new vantage point, they could see a small campfire flickering on a ledge below them. Two men sat by the fire, their rifles leaning against a rock. A small, huddled shape lay nearby, wrapped in a blanket. Nalin. They had a plan, worked out in whispers during their climb. Taza had sent a young boy, a fast runner, to Pete Calder's ranch before they left. Pete and three of his most trusted men would be waiting at the bottom of the main trail. Catherine held a shuttered storm lantern. When Taza had Nalin, she would give the signal. Taza moved down the rock face, a ghost in the moonlight. He was a predator in his own element, silent, fluid, and deadly. Catherine watched, her hands clenched around the cool metal of the lantern. She saw him drop behind a boulder near the camp. One of the guards stood up to stretch. Taza moved. It was not a fight. It was a conclusion. There was a soft thud, and the man crumpled to the ground. The second guard turned, his mouth opening to shout a warning, but Taza was already on him, a hand over his mouth, an arm around his throat. The man went limp. Taza sliced through the ropes that bound Nalin's hands and feet. He helped her up, whispering in her ear. She was frightened but unharmed, her spirit as resilient as a desert flower. He looked up and gave Catherine a sharp nod. This was her moment. With trembling hands, she opened the shutter of the lantern. She swung it 3 times in a wide, slow arc, a beacon of light against the immense darkness. Seconds later, shouts erupted from the trail below. Pete Calder and his men, making as much noise as a dozen riders, were coming up fast. The two conscious guards, hearing the commotion and finding themselves suddenly alone, panicked. They scrambled away into the darkness, fleeing for their lives. The rescue was over. Nalin was safe. Silas Devereaux had lost his leverage. As they prepared to leave the hastily abandoned camp, Taza's foot kicked something in the dust. It was a leather pouch, dropped by one of the fleeing men. He picked it up. Inside was the treaty he was meant to have signed, but tucked behind it was another document, a deed of sale for a mining claim, dated 10 years prior. The seal at the bottom was not a territorial seal. It was the crest of a private railroad consortium based in St. Louis, a company known for its ruthless and often illegal acquisition of land. The name on the deed, the original claimant, was Silas Devereaux. The final piece was not yet in place, but for the first time, Taza held in his hand a map of his enemy's deception. The sky had been holding its breath for days, the air thick and heavy with the promise of rain. The usual crisp, dry heat had been replaced by a suffocating humidity that clung to the skin and made the red dust settle into a dark, damp blanket. When the rain finally came, it was not the gentle, life-giving shower the parched land craved. It was a deluge, a violent outburst from a bruised and angry sky. Sheets of water hammered the earth, turning the dry arroyos into churning brown rivers and the single street of Santo Dedo into a quagmire of mud. For Silas Devereaux, the storm was an opportunity. With Taza's arrest and the Apache leadership in disarray, he had worked his men without pause. The temporary dam, once a simple diversion, had been reinforced and built higher. Now, under the cover of the storm, he ordered the final channel blocked. The trickle of water that had been the spring's last gift to the canyon ceased entirely. Behind the crude wall of logs and packed earth, the water began to rise at an alarming rate, a muddy, swirling lake forming where none had been before. It was a monstrous act of spite and desperation. Having failed to secure the water by coercion, he would now hold it hostage, creating a weapon that threatened to destroy everything in its path. If the makeshift dam broke under the strain of the flash flood, it would send a wall of water and debris hurtling down the canyon, obliterating the Apache village before sweeping on to threaten the lower-lying parts of Santo Dodo itself. Taza, released from his cell but not from his burden, saw the finality of Devereaux's act. He saw the water rising, swallowing the sacred cottonwood trees that lined the spring. This was the final battle, not for a legal claim, but for the very existence of his people. He went to the dam, moving through the torrential rain with a grim, relentless purpose. He found Devereaux standing on the slick, muddy crest of the dam, a king surveying his terrible, temporary kingdom. Two of his hired guards stood nearby, their rifles useless in the downpour. The rain plastered Devereaux's fine city coat to his shoulders, but he seemed not to notice, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning, a mask of triumphant madness. "It is over," Chief Devereaux yelled over the roar of the storm and the groaning of the strained timbers. "The water is mine, the land will be mine." "This is not ownership, it is madness," Taza shouted back, his voice a raw force of nature against the wind. "This will not hold. You will kill us all, my people. Your own town." "A calculated risk," Devereaux laughed. "A wild, unhinged sound. When this valley is underwater, the government will have no choice but to declare it uninhabitable for your kind, and I will be here to rebuild, to control the future." He took a step towards Taza, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light. Taza did not back away. They met in the middle of the dam, the churning water on one side, the steep drop to the canyon floor on the other. It was not a fight of fists, but of wills, a primal confrontation between creation and destruction. Devereaux lunged, his movements clumsy in the slick mud, trying to shove Taza from the precipice. Taza caught his wrists, their bodies locked in a desperate struggle on the shaking, unstable ground. It was then that Sheriff Cobb arrived with his deputies. But they were not alone. Behind them, trudging through the mud, was a small, determined army. At the front was Catherine, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a cold fire. Beside her was Pete Calder, his expression grim. And behind them were the men she had summoned, the ranchers and farmers Pete had rallied, and a surprising number of the railroad workers she had treated in the fever camp. They carried not guns, but shovels, axes, and lanterns, the tools of builders, not destroyers. They had seen the rising water. They had heard Catherine's frantic warnings, and they understood that this was no longer an Apache problem. This was their problem. Sheriff Cobb reined in his horse, his face a picture of confusion. He had come to support Devereaux, to enforce his corrupt version of the law, but he had expected to face a lone Apache, perhaps a few of his warriors. He had not expected to face his own community. He looked from Silas Devereaux, now wrestling like a madman in the mud, to the stoic, determined faces of his neighbors. His bluster evaporated, leaving only the weak, vacillating core of the man. For the first time, he hesitated. Into this tableau of chaos and shifting loyalties, a new figure appeared, a lone rider on a strong horse, wearing a long oilskin coat. He was an older man, with a neat gray beard and eyes that missed nothing. He rode with an air of quiet, unshakable authority. He dismounted and strode towards the dam, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "Silas Devereaux," he asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. Devereaux, momentarily distracted from his struggle with Taza, looked over. "Who is asking?" "Arthur Hayes, Territorial Inspector," the man said, pulling a leather wallet from his coat and flashing a badge. "I received an urgent telegraph 2 days ago regarding a dispute over this spring. I have also been met by a delegation of your citizens bearing a petition. I have reviewed the preliminary claims. This entire construction is illegal. It is hereby ordered to be suspended. All your documents, titles, and maps are to be confiscated pending a full federal inquiry." Devereaux stared, his mouth agape, as if he had been struck by lightning. At that moment, as if on cue, the sky unleashed a brilliant, blinding bolt. It did not hit the dam, but struck a towering pine tree on the canyon rim nearby. The massive tree exploded in a shower of splinters and fire. The ground shook. A deep, sickening groan came from the heart of the dam. A major support beam, weakened by the concussion, cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. Mud and water began to fountain from a new fissure in the dam's face. The legal confrontation was over, but the immediate crisis had reached its peak. The dam was failing. The sluice gate, Taza yelled, pointing to a large, iron-wheeled mechanism on the side of the dam designed as a fail-safe. "We have to open it. Release the pressure." Panic was a cold snake in the crowd, but it was Taza's voice, the voice of a leader, that cut through it. Hayes, the inspector, looked at Taza, then at Pete Calder, and gave a sharp nod. "Do it." Taza and Pete scrambled towards the gate, their old animosities washed away by the urgent need for survival. They put their shoulders to the heavy wheel, but it was jammed with mud and debris. The groaning of the dam grew louder. Some of the railroad men, their fear overcome by a sense of purpose, surged forward, adding their strength to the wheel. Catherine watched, her heart in her throat, her hands clenched into fists. And then she heard it. A new sound, cutting through the roar of the storm. It was a clear, metallic ringing. It came from down the new tracks, where a lone locomotive, a test engine, had been sitting. The engineer, seeing the swarm of lanterns and the chaos at the dam, understood the danger. He began to pull the cord for the great brass bell, not in a rhythmic signal, but in a frantic, continuous alarm. It was not the sharp crack of a gunshot, the sound of division and death. It was the sound of a community bell, a warning, a call to unity that echoed through the entire valley. With a final, desperate heave, the men on the wheel broke the sluice gate free. It screeched open, and a torrent of brown water erupted from the side of the dam. relieving the immense pressure on the failing structure. The terrible groaning subsided. The immediate danger of a catastrophic collapse had been averted. In the eerie quiet that followed, broken only by the rain and the tolling of the distant bell, everyone looked at Silas Devereaux. He stood alone in the mud, his fine suit ruined, his face a mask of utter ruin. His weapon had been disarmed, his legal authority shattered. Inspector Hayes turned to Sheriff Cobb. "Sheriff," he said, his voice cold as steel, "arrest this man." Cobb, seeing his chance to salvage his own position, moved with a sudden, uncharacteristic efficiency. He pulled a pair of iron manacles from his belt and snapped them onto Devereaux's wrists. The fight was over. Exhausted, soaked, and covered in mud, the unlikely alliance of Apache, ranchers, and railroad men stood together on the trembling dam. They had faced the fury of the storm and the madness of a greedy man, and they had survived, not as separate factions, but as a single, unified community. The water, which Devereaux had tried to use to divide and destroy them, now flowed freely, a testament to their collective strength. The days that followed the storm were a time of quiet accounting. Inspector Hayes was a man of meticulous habits and unswerving integrity. His survey was not a matter of guesswork or convenience, but of chains and transits and old, dusty maps pulled from territorial archives. He and his team worked for a week, driving wooden stakes into the damp red earth, their movements precise and impartial. The entire community watched. The Apache from the canyon's edge, the townspeople from the muddy track below. The silence was thick with a century of conflict and the fragile hope of a just resolution. The verdict, when it came, was a testament to Hayes's wisdom. He gathered the leaders of both communities at the base of the now dismantled dam. His findings were clear. The sacred spring itself, and the lands immediately surrounding its source, were unequivocally within the boundaries of the traditional Apache territory, as established by treaties that predated the town's existence. A quiet, collective sigh of relief came from Taza and his people. But Hayes did not stop there. He also acknowledged that the town of Santo Dedo had a legitimate need for water, and that a shared resource was the only path to a lasting peace. A new boundary stone was set, a heavy granite marker that felt more permanent than any wooden stake. A compromise was reached, brokered by Hayes, Pete Calder, and a newly humbled Taza. The Apache would have soul, unrestricted access to the spring's source. The outflow, the creek that ran through the canyon, would be shared. A schedule was established, a simple but revolutionary document that allocated watering times for the Apache gardens and the town's livestock. The justice of the water was not ownership, it was stewardship. The town's own internal reckoning was swift. Sheriff Cobb, exposed as a man whose loyalty was for sale, was stripped of his badge by Inspector Hayes. He left town on the next morning stagecoach, a shrunken, bitter figure. In his place, Hayes appointed Pete Calder as the acting sheriff until the county could hold a proper election. The appointment was met with a resounding, town-wide approval that was its own form of justice. With the legal framework for peace in place, the hard work of healing began. The first and most pressing task was to secure the canyon against future floods. The storm had weakened the banks of the creek, and the memory of the near disaster was still raw. What happened next would have been unthinkable only weeks before. The railroad men, idled by the legal proceedings against Silas Devereaux, were offered a fair wage by Pete Calder, from a town fund established for that purpose. To help, they came not with the arrogance of conquerors, but with the quiet humility of men who had been shown a kindness they had not earned. They worked alongside the Apache and the ranchers, and it was the Apache who taught them. Taza directed the work, showing them how to build check dams not with rigid lumber, but with woven willow branches and carefully placed stones, the traditional way his people had managed the water for generations. These barriers were not meant to stop the water, but to slow it, to guide it, to work with the natural flow rather than against it. Catherine watched as men who had once tried to pull Taza from his horse now listened to him with a quiet respect. She saw a railroad worker share his canteen with an elderly Apache man, the two of them communicating not with words, but with a simple, shared nod of understanding. The work was hard, their bodies slick with sweat and mud, but there was a lightness in the air, a sense of shared purpose that was more powerful than any treaty. They were not just building flood barriers, they were rebuilding their community, one stone, one woven branch at a time. Amidst this communal healing, Catherine began her own project of renewal. Her small, dusty room at the back of the mercantile was no longer just a clinic. She cleared a space, built a few crude benches, and tacked a slate to the wall. She opened her school. In the mornings, she taught the ranchers' children their letters and sums. In the afternoons, she walked to the canyon, where a small group of Apache children waited for her. Nalin was at her side, no longer just an interpreter, but an assistant teacher. The ordeal of her kidnapping had not broken her, it had forged her. There was a new confidence in her eyes, a new strength in her voice. She moved between the two languages with a fluid grace, a living bridge between two worlds. She taught the Apache children the English words for sun and moon, and she taught Catherine the Chiricahua words for water and family. The laughter of children learning together, their voices mingling in two different languages, became the new sound of hope in the valley. Taza watched it all. He watched his people working alongside the white men. He watched the woman he had once seen only as a courageous outsider become the heart of a new kind of community. He saw the way the children trusted her, the way Nalin blossomed under her guidance. The crack in the wall around his heart had widened into a fissure, and light was pouring in. One late afternoon, when the heat of the day had finally broken and the canyon was filled with cool, blue shadows, he found her sitting alone in a shallow cave not far from the spring. It was a peaceful, sheltered place, the air cooled by the damp stone and the sound of the gurgling water a gentle, constant song. She was staring at the obsidian arrowhead he had given her, turning it over and over in her hands. He entered the cave and sat a respectful distance from her. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time. The only sound, the whisper of the spring, the turmoil of the past weeks had been stripped away, leaving only this quiet, essential peace. She looked up at him, her gray eyes clear and steady. She had never been more beautiful to him than she was in that moment, her face smudged with chalk dust, her hair coming loose from its pins, her spirit shining with a soft, resilient light. Slowly, she reached out her hand, not in a gesture of passion, but of quiet reverence. She laid her fingers on his forearm, directly on the pale, silvery line of the scar. His skin was warm, the memory of the wound a faint, ridged line beneath her touch. She leaned in, her voice not a public declaration, but a soft, private whisper that was meant only for him, a sacred confirmation between their two souls. The Apache chief refused every bride, she murmured, her gaze holding his, until one gentle virgin touch broke his sacred vow. The words were the same ones she had spoken in the crowded, hostile market. But here, in the sanctuary of the cave, their meaning was transformed. It was no longer a challenge to his fear, but an acceptance of his history. It was not a claim born of desire, but a recognition of the trust that had grown between them, a trust that had healed a wound far deeper than the one on his arm. He felt the last of his defenses dissolve, washed away by the gentle current of her words. The vow he had carried for so long, a burden of grief and solitude, no longer had any power over him. It was a ghost, and she had just shown it into the light. He raised his own hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking the soft line of her jaw. He leaned in, closing the small space that remained between them. Their first kiss was not a fire, but a quiet, profound homecoming. It was as gentle as the rain that had finally washed the land clean, as soft as the cool air in the cave. It was a kiss of gratitude, of recognition, of a promise made not in words, but in the simple, perfect language of two hearts finally finding their shelter in each other. The season turned. The violent, cleansing rains of late summer gave way to the crisp, clear air of autumn. The sky over Santo Dedo was a deep, unwavering blue, and the cottonwood trees that lined the now peacefully flowing creek began to turn a brilliant, heartbreaking yellow. It was a season of harvest, of gathering in, of promises kept. Their joining was not a grand affair. It was as quiet and profound as the canyon at dawn. They stood in a small, sun-dappled clearing near the sacred spring, a place of immense spiritual significance for Taza's people. The only witnesses were those who had forged this new world with them: Pete Calder, his acting sheriff's star pinned to a clean work shirt; Hector Ortega, his eyes soft with a paternal pride; and Nalin, who stood beside Catherine, her presence a testament to the future they had all fought for. The elder, Goya, presided, his face a testament to the endurance of his people. There was no talk of contracts or property. The ceremony was a simple, ancient binding. Goya spoke in the melodic language of the Chiricahua, his words a blessing that wove their two spirits together. He took a single strip of soft, white deerskin and gently wrapped it around their joined hands, a physical symbol of a bond that was already unbreakable. He spoke of the strength of the willow that bends in the wind, and the endurance of the stone that stands in the river. He spoke of two paths becoming one, not to erase what was, but to create a trail strong enough for all the seasons to come. Taza placed a ring on Catherine's finger. It was not gold or silver, but a simple, perfect band carved from the dark, hard wood of a mountain mahogany tree, polished until it shone with a deep, warm luster. Catherine, in turn, did not give him a ring. Instead, she took the obsidian arrowhead from a small pouch at her waist. It was threaded onto a thin leather cord. She placed it around his neck, the cool, dark stone resting against his chest. It was the symbol of his wound, of her healing, of the debt of honor that had blossomed into love. It was the beginning of their story, and it would now rest always close to his heart. A few days later, they made the journey to the county seat with Pete Calder. In a dusty, sunlit office, before a justice of the peace who looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and respect. They signed their names in a large, leather-bound ledger. This second ceremony, so different from the first, was just as essential. It was an acknowledgement of the world they now lived in, a promise to navigate its laws and customs together. It was a bridge, built not of rope and wood, but of ink and paper, connecting the ancient traditions of the canyon with the burgeoning reality of the territory. Catherine O'Rourke became, in the eyes of the law, Catherine Nietzsche. She wore the wooden ring on her finger, and on a cord around her own neck, tucked beneath her dress. She now wore a second, smaller arrowhead Taza had made for her, a twin to his own. The life they built was as strong and practical as the flood barriers in the canyon. It was a life of shared purpose. Taza was no longer a solitary leader, defending his people against the world. He was a statesman, a true chief who spoke for the entire valley. The pronoun he used most often now was we. He met with Pete Calder weekly to discuss the irrigation schedule, to plan for the winter, to mediate the small disputes that are the currency of any community. He spoke with a new kind of authority, one born not of suspicion and defense, but of shared interest and mutual respect. He had learned that the strongest walls are not the ones you build around your heart, but the ones you build together with your neighbors. Catherine's life, once a nomadic search for a place to belong, had found its anchor. She was no longer just a traveler passing through. She was a cornerstone. The small schoolhouse, built with lumber from the railroad and labor from both Apache and white settlers, became the true center of the town. The sound of children reciting their multiplication tables in the two languages became the valley's new anthem. Catherine was a natural leader, her guidance a gentle but steady force. She taught reading and writing, but she also taught compassion and understanding. She saw the potential in every child, whether their skin was pale or brown, and nurtured it with a fierce, unwavering dedication. Naylin became her most accomplished protégé. The young woman who had once been a victim was now a powerful voice for her generation. She was a gifted teacher, moving with effortless grace between the two cultures, translating not just words, but ideas, customs, and dreams. She began to write down the old stories of her people, told to her by Goya, preserving them in the new language of the written word. She was the future, a woman who honored the past without being trapped by it, who embraced the new world without surrendering her identity. The scars of their conflict began to fade, replaced by the marks of their cooperation. The memory of Silas Devereaux, who was tried and sentenced to a long prison term for his crimes, became a cautionary tale whispered by old men, a reminder of what happens when one man's greed is allowed to poison the well of a community. The fear and mistrust that had once defined Santo Dedo were replaced by a cautious but growing sense of shared destiny. Love and family had proven to be the only true anchors in the storms of life, and the collective will of a just community had proven stronger than the ambition of any single man. One golden afternoon, in the late autumn of that transformative year, Taza came to the schoolhouse at the end of the day. He stood in the doorway and watched Catherine as she helped a small Apache boy and a rancher's daughter clean the slate. They were laughing, their heads close together, their differences invisible in the shared, simple task. Outside, the last of the children were tending to the small garden they had planted together, a clever system of troughs, fed by a small, wooden water wheel, brought a steady stream of water from the creek, from the sacred spring. The water, the source of so much conflict, now irrigated rows of late-season corn, squash, and beans, a testament to their shared labor. The children's laughter was a bright, happy sound on the clean air. In the distance, from the direction of the newly completed railway line, a bell began to ring. It was a clear, resonant sound that echoed off the canyon walls. It was not an alarm. It was not a threat. It was the 3 o'clock train, signaling its approach. And it was also the signal that the school day was over. The children cheered and began to gather their things, their happy shouts a mix of English and Chiricahua. Catherine came out and stood beside Taza on the small porch, a tired but deeply contented smile on her face. They stood together, watching the children run home, watching the life they had built, a life that was so much richer and more complex than either of them could have ever imagined. The last rays of the sun set the canyon ablaze with colors of fire and gold. Taza put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. She leaned her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that had become as familiar and essential to her as her own. "The old vow is broken," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble against her ear, "so that we may keep a new one to protect each other, and to protect this water." She looked up at him, at the love and strength in his eyes, and then out at the peaceful valley. The water of the spring flowed freely, nurturing the garden, sustaining the town, giving life to all. And she knew that this new vow, forged in fire and sealed in trust, was the most sacred one of all. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and we invite you to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like the video, and press the hype button to help more people hear this tale.